All right. Well, we are continuing through our series on the mission of God for the family. We're in the middle of talking about what does it mean to parent like God. And one of the things that is, I think, really interesting or you see kind of happening right now is because of the swing against authority structures in the world in the past. I think now you've got a generation that's swinging headlong into authority structures and wanting them, and which is a good thing because God established authorities. But sometimes we overcorrect, or maybe we bring assumptions about things from the error into our reestablishment of them. So anything that you see this with anything that feminists say about um, about the authority of a family or a husband-wife relationship, that anything that they say, we just do the opposite, right? That kind of, and we don't stop to say, well, is their description of things real? Is it good? Is it true? Is it line up with reality? Or is our standard, it makes the feminists mad, and so then it must be true? Well, that's not really the way uh, that's not the way we're supposed to establish things. But with parenting, it's in particular um, issue because sometimes we think, well, being a father makes me the authority. Therefore, whatever I do is cleansed by my authority, right? I have the right to tell people what to do because I'm the dad. I tell people around here what to do. I'm the king of this castle, and so I can tell everybody. But the reality is, um, when Jesus comes and he talks to us about parenting, one of the things that he says is um, that the devil is also a father, right? So we are named. Our fatherhood is a reflection of God. For this cause, is Ephesians 3, for this cause I bow my knee unto the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, of whom the whole family in heaven and on earth has been named, right? God is a father. And so when he created people in his image, one of the things that he made was parents. Right? Fatherhood is a direct reflection of God. Being a parent, God made us parents because he is one. But then John 8, Jesus also tells us, ye are of your father, the devil. And the desires of your father you do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and the truth wasn't in him. He lies um, because he's the liar and the father of lies, or something like that. You have the devil is also a father, so being a father isn't automatically make whatever it is that you want or whatever it is you're going to do a good thing. So we want to talk about how the 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 that Christian fatherhood it has a radical uh, differentiator to it that is really really important. And uh, what does it mean? What does it look like to be a uh, a father in a Christian or biblical way? What does that look like to set our fatherhood apart biblically? And there's a couple of different things about that. So a big part of it is Psalm 123, children are a heritage of the Lord. The fruit of the womb is his reward, right? That we that Christian parenting thinks well beyond itself. It thinks historically, it thinks generationally, it thinks in terms of inheritance, receiving and giving. What heritage have we received? What heritage are we giving? How are the children the most important aspect of our heritage, right? So we can hand off an inheritance of money or a business or property. There's all sorts of things that we hand off to the next generation. But the people themselves the kind of people that we hand off is the most important thing. That's the most important aspect of the heritage. And children are a blessing and not a curse in that way. But like everything, the biggest blessings become the strongest curses when they go wrong. And so uh, a blessing that's not received by faith turns itself into a curse. So we want to raise our kids by faith and receive them as a blessing by faith, and then understand that we are handing them off to the future, right? That we don't get to hold on to them. They're not for us. That we're handing them off to in marriage, into business, into as teachers, as whatever it is that we're handing them off into the next generation for. We want to hand them off as a blessing because they're not for us. Children are an accessory to our life. And parenting by faith means that we think about the broader picture. God has a plan for our kids. Our kids have a story with God as their God, right? They have and that God is working out his will for them all of the time. And we're a tool. We're an extra in that story. We're all extras in the story of Christ and his relationship with the Father and then his relationship with the world. But we're also extras in the life of our children. Um, and that's, that is really kind of where it is with lots we with everybody that we meet, that we want to consider them as more important than ourselves. We think of them as having their own story, uh, um you know and but it's harder with our kids because they come from us, and so then we feel like we have a right to their life as somehow being centrally important to our life. But really, we're handing them off to the Lord and to the life that God has for them, and into the world as part of our uh, heritage. Um, and uh, that means that parenting is a particular sort of relationship, and it's a rare relationship in people's lives. They only have a few parents, two, maybe more, depending on the situation. Um, but that very particular kind of relationship has an eschaton, it has an end, it has something that we're aiming at, which is you go into the world and transform it. And so I'm raising a transformative agent for God's kingdom, right? That's what we do. And the way, the central to the way that we do that is, Paul says in First Corinthians 4, um, is you might have a lot of instructors, right? You might have a lot of teachers in Christ, but you don't have a lot of fathers. Um, and he uses the metaphor of parenting as I led you to the Lord, right? I've begotten you through the gospel. Um, therefore, he says, therefore, imitate me, right? Imitate me. You all imitate me because I've begotten you, right? That imitative relationship is the difference between a teacher who hands off knowledge and a parent who says, imitate me, follow me. Now, there's no way to hand off knowledge without also handing off imitation. So he's not saying something about teachers that there's not something about teachers that he's saying that isn't uh, that he isn't saying, I guess. But he says there's a particular relationship about begetting you that come on and take a family resemblance. Well, so C.S. Lewis, he was sort of infamous um, for the way that he taught because he uh, wasn't necessarily naturally a people person. And so he used to show up for class because he was a professor, he would show up just a smidge late so that he could come in and begin lecturing as he walks through the door. So there's no personal questions or conversations, and he'd lecture. And he apparently was a very uh, engaging lecturer. But as he was getting to the end of his time, he would move towards the door with his lecture, and he would say the last words with one foot out the door. And he was famous for this. And then you never really developed a personal relationship with him, and he had a lot. He answered a ton of letters, and so it wasn't he was a misanthropic person. He just wasn't going to have that kind of relationship with a lot of his students. Well, That's kind of a quirky thing for a college professor to do, but it'd be really a weird thing for a parent to have that kind of relationship. I give you information without ever giving you myself, right? But Paul says, "I am your father. Follow me. Come live." Live close enough that you see my whole life and you can imitate me. It involves imitation, it involves love, it involves teaching, it involves discipline. Um, uh, and we have looked at kind of imitation and love some already. Um, but I want to talk specifically about the establishment of standards in the home, and how you're not you're not giving just a list of rules. You're that it's always a an imitate me. The real standard is the imitation of the parents or of the father, right? The imitation is the real standard. So you want to always be clear, right? You're establishing the house rules. Here's how we live in this house, and you want to be clear that God's law and our house rules are not the same kind of thing, right? God's law applies everywhere to all people, and then we've got some house rules too that have to do with how we here do things. So, like, honor your mother is God's law, and it should be a house rule as well. But it's a different sort of thing than we had a house once that we rented that it didn't have a good place to store the poisonous chemicals, and we would keep them under the sink. Uh, but we also would, so we made a house rule that you couldn't go onto the linoleum in this particular house for our little kids. Right. Now you had to stay off of the linoleum because we didn't have a way to lock away what was dangerous. If that turned into a rule, no matter where we lived, or it was or what was going on, it was that would be ridiculous, right? Because going on to the linoleum was not the problem, but in that particular house, that was what we had to do to keep the kids safe. It's like don't go into the basement when there's something dangerous down there is different uh than don't lie, right? Tell the truth is a different sort of law. It's a God's That's God's law versus a house rule about how things um, how things go here in this particular place in this particular time for us as we live together. And you should uh, be working to establish in your kids' minds that God's law is fundamental and primary, and that the Beatitudes, the Ten Commandments, the greatest commandment, the fruits of the Spirit, right? You've got all sorts of different um, memorable summaries about how God's standard is taught, and it's helpful because then it can be reviewed and it can be practiced. Um, uh, but you also are going to have house rules, and um, it's actually helps establish your authority if you're clear about which are which. It seems like you're undermining your own authority by saying, "Well, my words are not as important as God's words," but it actually helps you establish your authority well because you're establishing your authority under God's authority. And when your kids are going to know that, right? Eventually, if they understand that you know that too, then it's going to help their imaginations um, when it comes time to listen and do what's asked of them. So the beginning, and so then the beginning of that is making sure that the standard is clear. Right? So um, the what the standard is. So um, the teaching of the standard. And so we had different ways, for example, when we would go to the grocery store, we had three simple or a simple statement of the rules. No touching, no asking, no grabbing, right? No touching, no asking, no grabbing. Now, you might say no touching and no grabbing are going to be the same thing. Well, that was the particular temptation that was hard for my kids. And so it was repetitive. We repeated it at the beginning and at the end. No touching, no asking, no grabbing. Now, we would go to the store. When my kids were really little, I would take them each individually to the store, and we would go through the rules. Hey, okay, what are the rules at the store? No touching, no asking, no grabbing. And then I would walk them through the store, and we would practice so that I knew they understood it, so that when my wife had to take them to the store, she could just go through, she could just say, what are the rules? And they would say, no touching, no asking, no grabbing. Right. So, and I knew that they knew them because they would repeat them to me. And then we would go do the training to make sure that I knew their little bodies could actually accomplish the thing I was asking. Right. They might be able to say the words back to you, but maybe they can't actually do it yet. And so we would go and I would train them. Right. I would train them how to walk with the grocery cart. We wouldn't necessarily buy anything, or maybe we'd walk up and down the aisles, and if they went to go grab something, I would say, "Oh, remember, no grabbing," right? And say it again: no touching, no asking, no grabbing. Teach them how to walk with the cart. Teach them how to sit in the cart. Teach them all of the different things that I knew my wife was going to need to be able to have effective time shopping, even if she had to bring the kids, right? Which was pretty much the norm. She pretty much always had to bring the kids, and so we would I would teach them the rules about the grocery store, and then we would go train. Now, we had another thing in the home that we called the obedience game, because one of our rules was do what your mom asks, right? That was one of the house rules, and it's a God's law as well. But, and so we used to practice the obedience game, and we had, this was a different house, but we had a spot where the carpet turned into linoleum, and it had this really obnoxious gold strip of metal across the two. And so the we would start the game. I would say, okay, everybody put your toes on the gold. And first we just trained them, at random times. I'd say toes on the gold, and they'd show up, and I'd have marshmallows and pass them out, and they would get a marshmallow for getting their toes on the gold. And we would train them, how to basically come to attention when it was time to receive the next command, right? And then as once we were getting good at that, there would be all sorts of fun things that I would tell them to do front once they got their toes on the gold, right? Go put your ear on the doorknob, right? Go run around the lemon tree, and then come back and put your toes back on the gold. And so they would run off, and they would do it, and they'd come back, they'd get giggling, go over and bite your mom's knee, that sort of, where it was fun, and everybody could be laughing, and they would but the idea was I was training their little bodies and their little souls on what does it look like to receive a command. So that when I wasn't around, my wife could say, okay, everybody toes on the gold, and the kids would come, and they would be in ears open, ready to do what's asked of them mode, right? So the teaching was telling them, you know what, I want you to listen to your mother. We uh, a we used the verse, a wise son here's the law of his mother, right? And so I would say to them, a wise child, and they would say, here's the law of their mother, right? So I would get the expectation into their ears and then out of their mouth, right? So that you're teaching them, so that they know the expectation, and then train their bodies to do it, right? Because it's not just a thing that's going on in their head. The obedience is a bodily activity, and so we would teach and we would train, and we try to be really minimal in the number of rules they had, clear that this was a God's law, this is a house rule, and then minimal in the number of rules they had. And then once I knew that they could say them, then we would also train them on how to do it. We'll talk about enforcement and of it next, and forgiveness next. But without those, then it's easy to just say, hey, I need you to do this. And then they don't do it. And you don't know, did I mess up in the training? Did I mess up in the teaching? Did they not really know the expectation? Could they really not actually do it? Or are they just being disobedient? Once you've taught them, You know that they know the expectation. Once you've trained them, you know they can do what's being asked of them. Then it's easy to sort out when they're disobeying, and then you can deal directly with the heart of the matter and not have to be dealing with the teaching and the training. Now, um, remember how I talked about the difference between giving rules and giving yourself? This is a real practical way that you give yourself, right? Little kids need time, and when you can make the training something that they enjoy, right? That it's part of the game, then you're doubling up on the joyful interactions that they get with a father, that they get to experience the joy and the magnanimity, and um, but also you're still working them towards when you as a dad you're not around, you know that they're going to be able to listen to their mom, and she really needs that, especially as they grow and they're harder. You can't just force them to do anything anymore, right? When they're really little, you pick them up and carry them away when you need them to do something or not do something. But when they get bigger, you need them in the habit of hearing and obeying their mom so that they can grow up and be wise, right? Because son, a wise son hears the law of his mother. So another good example of this was church. So I was often preaching, and so my wife was in the pew by herself. But I think this is a good practice, even if you're going to be with them. Um, Sitting still is really hard for my kids. It still is. It's hard for me. We are a classic ADHD up up and down family, right? We don't sit still well. But that meant that my wife in the pew was having to deal with all of it all at once, and I often was at quote unquote at work during that time, and so I wasn't there to help her. And so we used to practice sitting still as a way to really develop their skill of sitting still as kids, because there's so many blessings that you can't receive if you can't sit still long enough to receive them. There's a lot of uh, you know a lot of blessings that they take time to communicate. And so you want your kids to be learning how to sit still and receive, because there's so many good and important things that you receive that way. Well, there's the difficulty is, when they were little, I thought, well, okay, I'll just spank them when they move, right? That'll solve the problem. The problem is it just didn't work. It didn't solve the problem. And I realized that I actually didn't know if they could sit still. I was trying to enforce what I maybe was teaching. Hey, sit still. Do you know what sit still means? Yes, I know what sit still means. What are we supposed to do? Sit still. But I wasn't training their bodies to do it. And so um, we developed the stillness game, and what they would do is they would sit in chairs and with their, put their hands on their knees, and then I would balance chocolate chips and marshmallows, and then we get different kinds of candies. I would balance them on their hands and on their knees and on their shoulders and on the top of their head, and then I would set a timer. And we started with a short timer, 15 seconds, right? If you can sit still then you get to eat everything that stays balanced. And it was amazing how quickly, you work it up to a minute, you work it up to a couple of minutes, and it had a really big effect on them gaining the confidence that they could sit still. And then they would have a lot of fun. They would ask to practice sitting still, right? Um, and then we would do things. We would do audiobooks, and I would balance things on them and see how many things I could balance on them. Sometimes they would get giggling so hard it would fall off, but then you're having a good time. Um, and we discovered that if you lick the bottom of a dot, you can actually stick it to their foreheads. There's we've discovered a lot of fun things that way, but it was practice. We were training sitting still so that they could receive the blessings at church that come with being able to be a part of the liturgy of the church and receive and listen, but also having a good time and building a lot of fun memories together. So you don't have to always think in terms of a rivalrous relationship when you're teaching and training your kids. You want to figure out how can we be on the same side. And I have a hard time sitting still. It drives my wife crazy sometimes. And so it also was a way of um, me trying to figure out how do we give something that I don't have, and those were so there were some really fun ways that we uh, came up with to train, and as my wife and I would sit and say, well, what are the things? What's because you can't work on everything at once. And so my wife and I would say, what is it that we need to work on? And she would say, well, the kids are terrible at the store. It's like, okay, all right, well, let's come up. What are our rules? What's helpful? What are the things that are problem? Okay, they're grabbing stuff and they're asking for stuff constantly. Okay, well, that's what we need to train them, to teach them and train them to not do, so that they can go to the store with you and it becomes a pleasant experience, something you enjoy doing together. And that's always the goal is fellowship. Um, the house rules should be the sorts of things that get in the way, or should that keep you in fellowship, and keep them safe, right? Because you don't want them drinking drinking poison or bleach or something. So all right, so that's teaching and training, and we will talk next about enforcement and forgiveness, because those are the other aspects of the cycle.